Good evening. I am joining you live tonight from my tent because I am doing a session all about camping in literature. Now, this was inspired partly, or in fact, largely, by the fact that I went to a rather fabulous literary salon last Friday night, which was Damien Barr's literary salon, where Damien was talking to Douglas Stuart, the Booker Prize winner, who has just written an amazing and stunning book called, here we go, just finding it for you to show it to you, called Young Mungo, which I am going to be talking about tonight. And it has some very stunning and dramatic and rather violent scenes connected with camping. And it's that got me started thinking about camping in literature. But of course, there's many far more happy and innocent scenes of camping in literature, which I'm also going to talk about. Because I'm broadcasting live from my tent tonight, I am having a little bit of trouble getting my technology set up effectively, so I do apologise for the slight issues. Could anyone tell me who's listening on Instagram if the sound is adjusted in a bad way by what I've just done? Let me know if so. Anyway, it's lovely to see you all here this evening, and I hope you can see me in my tent. And I'm going to be talking to you about many fabulous books relating to camping. As you can see, it's raining in here on Instagram anyway. I'm kind of loving that effect. Oh, good. I sound fine. Thank you for telling me. So, one of the reasons, apart from having just read Young Mungo, which has these amazing camping scenes in it, that I wanted to talk about camping in literature is because I have been very much a camper all my life. My parents were major campers. They used to take us camping in the outback in Australia when we were little, 4 children, going across the outback, going to places like Ayers Rock, camping in billabongs, dried up creeks. And our parents used to read to us from short stories from the likes of Sherlock Holmes and also Saki, also known as H.H. Munro, around the campfire. And those are some of my happiest memories. We also went camping in Iran, where we lived when I was very little, Finland, and England, and also around Europe, particularly in France. So I've been camping for all my life, and in those days it was all much more complicated. We had to carry around these incredibly heavy camp beds, which are actually really good and very comfortable, but they are full of iron, which makes them really not an easy joy to put up, unlike the joys of blow up beds these days. I wonder if any of you watchers here this evening are campers. If you are, give me a wave and let me know whether you love camping or do you actually find it really oppressive, and do you hate it? Do you hate having those insects coming into your tent, and particularly in far-flung countries, even tarantulas? Or do you love sleeping under the stars and singing around campfires of an evening, or just enjoying looking up at the stars? Anyway, I'm going to share with you some of my favourite camping literature this evening. And one of the first books that I want to talk to you about is Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden, which is a book that starts off with a lovely camping scene, and now it's suddenly disappeared, the bit that I want to read from you, because we've written about it in The Story Cure. Here we go. I think I've just found it. So this is the book that I wrote with Susan Elderkin, The Story Cure, which came after the novel Cure, An A to Z of Literary Remedies. And this is a book all about what books you should give your children to read to help them with various ailments. So the cure that we have tomorrow when the war began for is feeling like you're no good at anything. And that is a very common ailment that children have. Now, we've got three cures for that. We have The Dot by Peter Reynolds, which is a fantastic picture book for young children. We have Ordinary Jack by Helen Cresswell, which is a chapter book for children of maybe 8 to 12. And I'm not going to tell you about them tonight because I want to tell you about Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden, which is for young adult readers, really. So this is our section about that book, the camping section. Most underachievers are actually just late bloomers. When Ellie, the narrator of Tomorrow When the War Began, the first in the gripping Tomorrow series, invites Homer to join her and some friends on a camping trip, but out bush, she describes him as a rabble-rouser. Having grown up living next door to him, Ellie likes Homer, but he recently got into trouble for setting fire to a line of solvent on the road, then waiting for cars to come along, and none of the girls at school take him very seriously. She, Homer, and the others hike to a spot so remote and hot that it's known locally as Hell. Here they hang out for a few days, having the usual teenage spats and relationship intrigues. It's only when they return home to find their families have disappeared that they realise the mysterious planes with no lights that flew overhead one night had in fact been a stealth invasion. Overnight, they are forced into that role of insurgents, with neither weapons nor adults to help. As they make their first terrifying forays into enemy territory, learning as much as they can about the encampment where their families are being held, Homer emerges as the natural leader, always one step ahead. He stays calm, keeps them all from sliding into despair, and thinks in strategic ways. It was getting hard to remember, writes Ellie as she records it all in her diary, that this fast-thinking guy who just spent 15 minutes getting us laughing and talking and feeling good again wasn't even trusted to hand out books at school. Sometimes people underachieve not because of a lack of ability, but because of a surfeit of undirected intelligence. For the child who's yet to find an arena in which to excel, Homer is a great role model. So that's Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden. And that's a great book that starts with a camping scene and then becomes a dystopian disaster novel. Very exciting, and actually would be a great book to read while camping, which is another theme that I want to touch on tonight, which books you would most love to read while camping. So I'm going to talk about a few other children's books relating to camping before moving on to the adult ones. Another brilliant camping novel is Brendan Chase. So lots of these books that we're talking about this evening in a way are not about camping in a tent. Some of them are just about camping outside under the stars, and that is a very common theme in children's literature. Meg Rosoff's How I Live Now is another example, which is absolutely brilliant, which is not really a camping novel. It's a dystopian novel in which people are forced to live outside and use their natural resources or their survival skills. Brendan Chase, written and illustrated by Dennis Watkins Pitchford, also known as BB, is about three brothers who ran away from home to live like Robin Hood and his merry men deep in the forest of Brendan Chase. They make their camp in an ancient oak tree and live like outlaws, loving the dangers and excitements of their wild surroundings. And here's a quote from the book which makes you want to go and live outside in the wild, far away from society. It seems to me This idea of going to school and then into business isn't the natural way for a man to live, at least to my way of thinking. Don't you see what most people are missing? Something which is fine and grand, living like we do, I mean, out in the open air. They're getting further and further away from natural life, nature, and all that. They're creating a world which is, oh, I don't know, I can't jaw properly, but you know what I mean. It makes their adventure seem like a fantastic off-grid concept for us all to get away from the pressures of modern life. And if you feel like that's something you'd like to do, you should definitely read Brendan Chase, which is a really great kind of boy's own adventure. Another one which is a great camping novel for kids is Eight Cousins, which is one of Louisa May Alcott's best and most underrated books, which has an extended narrative within it about the cousins camping out on an island in the late 1800s. It's actually a really interesting book in many ways, partly because it's very early as a book written in the timeline about recreational camping, because recreational camping wasn't really a thing until perhaps the mid 19th century. It was published in 1875, so the Civil War was pretty recent, and the religious camp meeting movement, both important contributors to the development of the idea of recreational camping, was still going strong. The kids in the book row out to an island, set up tents, swim in the ocean, catch lobsters and roast them, and stay up by the campfire, singing and telling tales before sleeping under the stars, which is a pretty fantastic and beautiful image. We must mention Enid Blyton when talking about kids' books relating to camping. Five Go Off to Camp is a classic Enid Blyton novel in which Julian, Dick, George, and of course Timmy the dog take off with tents in the seventh of the 21 famous five book series. Although, to be fair, they do their camping with tents or gypsy caravans, or on an island, or in a lighthouse, or anywhere that grown-ups are not throughout most of the books. In this one, unusually, there's actually an adult present for most of the novel, as after the mishap in the last of the famous five novels, they're not allowed to go off without a chaperone who, in this case, is Mr. Luffy. But it all works out in a very famous five kind of style, with secret tunnels, good old Julian being sexist again, and brave old Timmy the dog saving the day. Hurrah! So that's another great children's book relating to camping. We must also mention one of my favourite books that I have talked about before on one of these evenings, which is My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, which is an absolutely brilliant novel about a boy who lives in New York with his far too many siblings. I think he has 7 siblings, and he decides that he's going to go off and live on his own in a piece of old farmland that belongs to his family, far, far away from New York in the middle of the countryside. And he creates himself the perfect camp out of a hollowed out tree, where he then lives for a whole year, and he eventually builds himself a little hut in the woods, which happens in the second book in the series. But he, Sam Gribley is the name of the boy, is an absolutely brilliant camper. He starts off not having a clue. He doesn't know how to catch fish, let alone cook them over a fire, let alone actually make himself a fire. But he manages to overcome all these difficulties, partly by going to the library and finding out ways that he should be catching and descaling fish, and partly by using his own natural resources. And he also teaches a peregrine falcon to help him to catch little creatures to live off. And he goes and lives in the hollow of this tree which he then gets iced into by an incredibly thick icicle bound winter, which is all really exciting. And it's just a fantastic book, which does make you totally want to go and live in the wild all on your own. And he does have a few adventures with other people as well, but it's pretty much all about being on his own and surviving that. Another one in the same vein is Hatchet by Gary Paulson, which is an absolutely fabulous novel again about a boy who goes off on in a very small aeroplane with a pilot to go and find his dad, to go and stay with his father on the other side of the country. And while he's flying, the pilot is taken ill. I think he has a heart attack and dies. And the boy has to somehow survive, and he crashes on a tiny island in the middle of the lake, in the middle of a lake in the middle of nowhere. And all he has with him to help him survive is this little hatchet, which his mum gave him as a going away present. And he manages to use the hatchet as a tool that helps him to survive over the next few terrifying and rather hideous weeks and months. And he does survive. He's a very resourceful boy, and it's a really great camping novel. But in this case, there is no canvas, there are no zips, there are no handy lights to help him survive. All he's got is his hatchet and some contents, admittedly, from the aeroplane, which came down with him, and a few useful tools. But it's a really great survival story. So moving on, have I got any more children's books? I'm sure I have, but we might come back to them. And I'd love to know if you have any personal favourites, by the way, of camping books for either children or adults. And if camping is something that fills you generally with joy, or perhaps the opposite. Some great adult fiction in which camping is a major part of the book. Don't know where to start because I've got some really good ones. One of my favourite camping related adult novels is Cold Mountain by Charles Frazier, which is a book all about a man going on a huge odyssey in which he's leaving his part as a soldier in the Civil War and turning his back on the carnage of the battlefield, beginning the treacherous journey back home to Cold Mountain. So the hero is called Inman, and he is spending his odyssey trying to get back to the woman that he loves, who's called Ada, and he struggles to survive as he goes on this enormous odyssey. And it's such a great read. Also, by the way, fantastic on audio, because it's read by the author and he's got an absolutely glorious voice. I would totally recommend it to everyone. And I'm just going to read you a little section from it so that you get a sense of what a great book it is. Some days later, Inman climbed all morning, not really knowing where he was. Mists moved ahead of him like deer through the trees. And then, for the afternoon, he walked a ridgeline trail that rolled between balsam highlands and little gladed gaps, where stood beech groves and the tail ends of cove hardwoods, as they reached the highest places where they could live. As he walked, he began to suspect that he knew roughly where he was. It was an old passway, that much was clear. He passed a rock cairn that the Cherokee in times long past were in the habit of building along the way to signify something, though whether waymarker or memorial or holy place was now unknowable. Inman picked up a fresh rock and dropped it on the pile in passing as commemoration of some old upward yearning. Late in the day, he found himself on a rocky scrap bordered by heath bald, a thick tangle of waist-high azalea and laurel and myrtle growing right to the bare rock of the ledge. The trail emptied onto it as if travellers had made a custom of stopping to admire the view. Then the way re-entered the forest through a faint passage in the azalea not 40 feet from where he had emerged. The sun was falling, and Inman reckoned he would again make a bivouac without benefit of fire or water. In the open space near the edge of the scarp, he scraped together what little duff there was to soften a sleeping place. He ate parched corn from his palm and stretched out in his bedding to sleep, wishing there were a bigger moon in the sky to light the prospect before him. He was awakened at first grey dawn to the sound of walking in the heath. He sat up and set the lamats on full cock and levelled it at the sound. In a minute, a black sow bear poked her head through the leaves, not 20 feet from where Inman sat. She stood, tan muzzle up, neck stretched long, sniffing the breeze and blinking her little eyes. I'm very glad that we don't get bears in Cornwall, which is where I normally go camping. But if you do enjoy camping, read Cold Mountain, because it's very much about the joys of sleeping out in the wilderness, and it does tell a really fantastic tale of a long odyssey. I'm just going to have a little bit of my camp coffee while I remember the next book that I was going to talk about. I hope that all you campers out there have a good thermos, which is very important. And I hope that coffee lovers like you have a great way of making coffee when you're camping. Coffee lovers like me, that is. So yeah, before I carry on with other great adult literature with camping in it, this is a book which is a book for adults, but it's a really lovely and charming book about travelling to many different far-flung places. It's called Shape of a Boy. It's by Kate Wickers, and it's about Kate Wickers, the travel journalist, travelling with her 3 sons through many different places over the years as they grew up, from when the oldest one was in utero in March 2000 to each chapter tells you how old the 3 boys are. So in the first one, Ernie brackets Josh is in utero, age 15 weeks, and then in the next chapter we have, and that's when they go to Israel and Jordan. The next chapter we have Ernie, now named Josh, age 3 months, going to Mallorca, and then we have many different chapters where the 3 boys are different ages, going to different places, and Mauritius, Josh is 10, Ben is 8, and Freddie is 4, and so on. So all of these chapters take Kate, her husband, and their 3 sons to many different places around the world, and it's a really great book describing the adventures of a mum, sometimes a mum and dad, with their 3 boys travelling round the world, sometimes in hotels, sometimes in different places. But there's a great chapter that takes place in Sri Lanka, which is about camping, and I'm just going to read you a little section of that to give you an idea of the flavour of the book. And I kind of slightly put it in the bracket of some of the books that are for children, simply because it's about children, but it is actually a kind of memoir for anyone to read of any age, but it's quite likely to be read maybe by parents who are thinking about travelling with their children in various guises. So this is called Sri Lanka, A Lesson in Karma, where the 3 boys are Josh, age 11, Ben 9, and Freddie 6. 31st of December 2011, Udawalawi National Park, Sri Lanka. And this is a section of Kate's diary that she's put into the book. Big drama in camp last night. Freddie had a nightmare and woke up screaming. He was so involved with his dream but it took me a few minutes to calm him down, and by that time our tent was surrounded by armed guards. Neil, Josh and Ben, who were in the tent next door, also woke up and came rushing out to see what all the fuss was about. They'd obviously assumed the worst, that a leopard had managed to unzip the tent, or a tarantula had joined us in bed. The fringed ornamental tarantula, endemic in Sri Lanka, is one of the deadliest in the world, even though it sounds like it's dressed up to go to a party. That's making me worried that there might be a tarantula behind me in the tent. I assured them that all was fine, but the guards insisted on scouring the tent for unwanted guests. We just check for Najas, one said, shining a torch under the bed. Najas, I asked, hoping above all else that this wasn't some kind of snake. Sri Lankan cobra, he replied, confirming my worst fears. They like warm places, like safari tents. And beds. Do you often see them? The guard waggled his head in a non-committal way. Are they dangerous? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and measured. Do not worry, we have excellent first aid, he told me. I'm sure this was meant to reassure, but for the remainder of the night, Freddie and I huddled in one bed under blankets, both completely terrified. In daylight, the camp looked serene again, and we watched the sun rise over the river and kingfishers flit along the banks, while breakfasting on hoppers, a bowl-shaped pancake made from rice flour and coconut milk. Out on safari, we saw a herd of elephants flicking up red dust to cool their backs, and pelicans perched on skeletal white trees. But Ben made the best and most surreal spot of all. A wild buffalo slumped in a mudslick with a tortoise sat on its back, like something from Aesop's fables. When we arrived back to camp, there was a fire of coconut husks lit and mugs of hot chocolate waiting for us. While I write this, the boys are swinging in hammocks strung between trees, and Neil is poking contentedly at the fire. What a happy way to end the year. That is a really lovely image of camping in Sri Lanka, which is a place that it would not have occurred to me to actually go camping, because I would imagine it would be far too hot. But it also sounds very exciting. And later on in that chapter, there's an encounter with an elephant, which is pretty exciting. So that was from Shape of a Boy, which is all about Kate Wickers, travel journalist and novelist, travelling with her 3 boys round the world to many different places, some of which is camping. Now, before I move on to Douglas Stuart, I just want to mention a couple of other novels for adults which star great camping scenes. So A Place Called Winter is a fabulous book by Patrick Gale, one of my favourite authors who I love to prescribe for bibliotherapy purposes, which is about a man called Harry Kane who goes to live in a place called Winter because he's effectively had to flee his life in England, where he was married to a young woman, but he started having an affair with a man, and then he was caught, and it's 1900, and he gets a kind of option to escape and go to Canada, to a place where people are trying to start farms out there. So off he goes to Canada, to a place which is literally called Winter, and he has to start his own farm on very difficult land to grow crops on. And when he first goes there, he has to live in the freezing cold Canadian winter in a bell tent. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about that, because I love the fact that bell tents come from that era over 100 years ago. I guess they've probably been going for hundreds of years before that, probably going back to Mongolian times, like yurts. Obviously need to do a bit of a history of camping as well. I feel that maybe I need some non-fiction here to throw in about the way that tents have evolved. There must be a book about that. I'm going to find it. If I find it, I'll put it on my story tomorrow. Anyway, bell tents. I really enjoyed Patrick's description in this book of living in a bell tent in Canada in the early 1900s. To his shame, Harry had never erected a tent before, not even in school, so was happy Truls knew what he was about and took charge as they unrolled and set to pegging the baffling thing, telling Harry where to bang in pegs or secure poles. As they pulled the tent upright and he stepped inside, he felt a brief boyish glee, which was swiftly followed by a species of panic at the realization that this frail structure, and this alone, was now his home. As though sensing the faltering of his spirits, Truls insisted that they get on with heaving the little stove into place and securing the tin flue through the opening in the tent roof, pulling tight the cunning corset of leather straps and canvas which closed the gap around it to hold out the worst of the weather. They shared a bottle of beer to slake their thirst after their labours and christen the new home. Then Truls left Harry to pull his trunk and bags inside and begin unpacking, while he went off to discover the full content of Varco's perfidy over the fencing. Having assembled and made up his camp bed in one corner and arranged blankets for Truls and gathered a good heap of fairly dry wood for the stove, Harry left the tent, where the gloom and the powerful smell of newly unrolled mackintosh was threatening to overpower him, and took his brand new water bottle and whistling kettle in search of a stream where he could draw water fit to drink. He found one a little up the slope, tasted it gingerly at first, then eagerly when he found it sweet. Jorgensen had told him horror stories of men settling on land that proved to have only alkali water on it, and so on. So that's a really lovely description of putting up a bell tent, which is where Harry Kane has to live for the first few months when he creates his own farm in the middle of absolute nowhere in the wastelands of Canada. And it's a really exciting, great story, starting in London, taking you out to Canada, where Harry has many adventures, and we also get some really interesting glimpses into the ways of life out there at the time. So that's a great novel with adult camping in it. Another one which I love and frequently go back to is August by Gerard Woodward, which is the story of a family who go back to the same campsite over 30 years, which is in the middle of Wales. And it's a really lovely book about this family and their evolution from being a young couple with no children to having children who grow up, and until their children are grown up themselves in their 20s. And it, of course, starts off full of hope and positivity, but as the book continues, there are many rather terrible things that happen. There's glue sniffing, which is quite a major part of the novel. The mum in the book gets addicted to glue, and there's also alcoholism. And this is actually the first of a trilogy all about the people in this family. And Gerard Woodward is a really brilliant writer. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from the book about when they first find the campsite. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm in the right place in my book. Here we go. The early evening after a day's cycling was nearly always silent for Aldous and Leslie. Neither would feel much like talking. They were together but alone for a while, as though each was pitching an invisible tent of personal space, hammering in unseen pegs of identity. This was because cycling blended them into a single person. A whole day of cycling, of trying to match each other's pace, freewheeling side by side, becoming mirrors of each other's movements, made them almost into a single cycling entity, which in the evening had to be unglued back into two individual people. I love that metaphor of the silence between the two men being like a tent which the two men are erecting around themselves and then pegging in. So Leslie sat, his braces hanging down and his shirt sleeves rolled up, his bicycle inverted before him, its rear wheel between his raised knees. He was going through the spokes with a spoke key, tightening some, loosening others, trying to rid the wheel of a kink he was sure had developed. He looked like a harpist tuning his instrument. Aldous was standing near the entrance to the tent. He had changed out of the grey flannels and shirt of the cyclist into his evening clothes, tweed jacket and plus paws, with tartan socks and brown patent leather shoes. He'd just lit his pipe and was contemplating the view, which was unremarkable. Some clumps of yellowish trees, low dark hills in the distance. To the left, a lot of farm clutter, and was wondering if he had the energy to get his watercolours out and do a quick sketch. He hadn't. So that's kind of near the beginning of the book when they first come across the campsite, which is going to be the campsite where the family return to. So Aldous first discovers it with his friend Leslie, but then later on he and his family keep returning to the campsite for the next 30 years, every single August, hence the name of the book. And I'm going to read you another bit, which I think is a really great description of what it's like to find your campsite and find your own tent in the campsite when you are dying to get into that tent and turn it into a nice place to be. Colette's heart lifted when she saw their tent occupying this place. It was on the far side of the field, its fly sheet pegged to the grass on long guy ropes. It looked like the single sail of a ship come adrift from its vessel to be fastened to the world. It looked like a fallen kite or an early and unsuccessful attempt at a flying machine. When she unlaced its entrance and recognised some of the furnishings of Fernlight Avenue, a blanket, some books, a framed photograph of herself taken 20 years ago, all lit with green, she felt she was discovering the lost treasure of her own life. Colette had a genius for packing, which everyone needs who goes camping, let's face it. Aldous thought this when she unpacked the hamper. She reminded him of a stage magician he'd seen somewhere who, from the splintery interior of a similar hamper, had extracted a stepladder, a tall lamp standard, a set of golf clubs, and a beautiful woman. Colette produced clothes, bedding, a small tent for the boys, were pumped up, lilos which were breathed into, a lavatory tent like a Punch and Judy stall, folding chairs, crockery, snakes and ladders, Monopoly, Totopoly, lamps, cameras, binoculars, books, sketchbooks, canvases. Once Colette had transformed the mostly empty interior of the tent into a small home, and had set up a kitchen area within the tent's door guard, and once James and Janus were busy with ball games, Aldous wrapped his arms around his wife's waist from behind and rocked against her. "I've found it, haven't I?" he half whispered into her ear. "This is the place." Colette turned within the circle of her husband's arms and faced him. "Yes," she said, and kissed him. "Am I very clever?" Aldous went on. "Very," said Colette. "You told me to go and find somewhere, and I've found it." "Yes," said Colette. Who hadn't? No more sharing washrooms with loose-boweled brummies or trying to get to sleep in a field full of teddy boys. Aldous pressed his face into Colette's neck and laughed. Colette's neck absorbed his laughter, and then she laughed. She laughed a lot. There was something in the air. She found Languifinia very funny. She giggled helplessly when she was introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Evans. They're the farmers who own the field. Their symmetrical tall and short stances, his long mac worn even on the hottest days. Mrs. Evans' little round spectacles, her ankle socks, her grinning mouth of tiny teeth. Colette found all these caused her to laugh. When Colette laughed, it was as though she'd pegged herself out on her mirth. She hung there helpless with it swinging. She found the farm and its playful, attentive dogs funny, the haughty, nervous sheep funny. She even found the beach funny. The sand, piled up in soft mountain ranges, was funny. So was the sea retreating at low tide to a strip of glitter on the horizon beyond a perfect desert of beige sand. She's good at laughing, that Mrs. Jones, said Mrs. Evans to her husband, hearing the jocular approach of Colette through the farmyard one morning. So that's August by Gerard Woodward, which is an excellent read. And it actually reminds me a tiny bit of The Offing by Benjamin Myers, which is a book I've talked about on one of these recent lives, because of the way there's so much beautiful description of the landscape and the nature, and also the relationship of the people to the landscape that they inhabit, and their enormous appreciation of nature and the positives of being on the land in a way that you are uniquely when you're camping, the way that you appreciate the outside world in a way that you don't normally appreciate it. And Laughing John, I think you might love this book because I know how much you love The Offing, and I think it does have some things in common with it. And also, I know you like a complicated family with issues, and there's certainly quite a lot of those issues in this book. So that is a fantastic novel with camping in it. And I'm now going to talk a bit about Young Mungo, which is the book that got me thinking about this topic in the first place. So this is the new book by Douglas Stuart, who wrote Shuggie Bain, which won the Booker Prize last year. And I went to an excellent literary salon last week in which Douglas Stuart was in conversation with Damien Barr, talking all about how he came to write this book and why. And it is a book that I don't want to give spoilers to because it's highly dramatic and actually very exciting. And it has two crossover sections in the book. There's young Mungo's life in Glasgow with his mum, his brother, and his sister, where they live in a rather grim council flat. And there's also the parallel interwoven section of the book, which is all about Mungo being taken on a camping trip by two men who he essentially doesn't know, and his mother doesn't know them either. And he's only 15 when he's taken on this camping trip. And he's being taken on the camping trip in order to learn how to be a man. It's a complicated story because young Mungo is gay and he's started falling for a young man called James. And I think the adults in Mungo's life, including his mother, have started to worry about what kind of a boy he is. They don't know that he's gay because we're talking about growing up in the 1980s when it was just not acceptable to be gay, living in Glasgow in that context. And Mungo comes from a very working class and difficult family to grow up in if you are anything other than a quite violent and physical boy, which is what Mungo's brother is. And his brother is quite a terrifying character. So Mungo is, we don't know why, but he's been taken by these two men. Or we start at the beginning where he's being taken on a long bus trip out of Glasgow to a beautiful loch in the middle of nowhere, which they won't reveal where he's going to, so that he won't come back and spoil it with all of his young friends that he doesn't actually have. And there's many tragedies going on as Mungo is making his way to the this place in the loch, which I can't reveal. But one of the major tragedies is that Mungo's mum put him in the hands of these two men who she essentially has absolutely no idea what they're like. And she met through Alcoholics Anonymous because she's a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But despite the difficulties of Mungo's life and the fact that he is going through these rather terrible events, there's an amazing beauty in the writing of Douglas Stuart as he describes what the landscape is like around the loch. And there's this amazing juxtaposition between the brutality of what Mungo is going through, juxtaposed with the beauty and natural essence of the landscape. So I'm going to read you a little bit so that you will have a sense of the amazing writing of this book. And you'll see why he deservedly won the Booker Prize as well for his previous book, Shuggy Bane. The sun was dipping behind the hills by the time they reached the loch side. After the confines of the forest, the loch suddenly opened up and it was almost too expansive for Mungo to take in. He stumbled down to the shoreline. The day was drawing in to the last of her colours, and as the softest violets and apricots bled away into the horizon, he was sad to have not arrived sooner. Mungo tilted his head back and walked in a circle. The sky above him was a darkening blue, smeared with faint streaks of lemon. He hadn't known that the sky could hold so many hues, or he hadn't paid it any mind before. Did anyone in Glasgow look up? He let out a small, awe-filled sigh. All this beauty in the sky was mirrored in the loch, as though Mother Nature was bragging. Gallowgate grinned with pride. Wait till you see the sky at night. You've never seen a black like it. Gallowgate offered Mungo his shoulders to sit upon, so Mungo could glimpse the other side before it vanished entirely in the dusk. From this height, Mungo thought the loch must be 2 miles wide and 100 miles long. On the far side, it was hemmed in by stout hills, whose slopes were split like the underlying rock had torn through the very fabric of them. All the colours were patchy and mottled. It seemed to Mungo as though the hillsides had been blanketed in some giant, threadbare rug. The moss green and drab brown were rubbed away in patches to reveal the grey granite, as if it were the underlay of the land. There were scatterings of purple moorflower and golden gorse, and here and there were little pockets of white snow, clinging stubbornly to the deepest fissures. The loch diminished out of view on the left. To the right it turned around a lazy corner and disappeared behind a wall of pine trees. Mungo thought how it was 10 times bigger than his scheme, bigger perhaps than Glasgow herself. He had seen the sea twice before. There the water was always shaking and churning, but here the tide was lazy and the surface was glossy as a puddle. Nothing moved except for the buzz of black midges that swarmed low, and it excited a ripple of hungry fish. The loch looked colder and deeper than he could say. It looked sad, like it had been forgotten, quiet, like it kept its secrets. And as we discover as the book goes on, there are a lot of secrets that need to be kept as the book progresses. I'll just read you a tiny bit more before I'm going to talk about what books you might like to read while camping. And I'd love to know if you have any favourite books, either about camping or books to read while camping too. Gallowgate marshalled the set-up of camp around the stone fire ring. He took off his trendy nylon bomber, and the knees of his Italian denims were soon damp as he unpacked the pile of plastic bags. From the backpack he unfurled two thin-looking tents. The two-man tent he erected inside the abandoned bothy. The smaller tent he staked across the far side of the camp on a bed of dry shingle, almost as far away from the other as possible. Mungo helped drive the curved metal pegs into the ground with a flinty rock. Shouldn't the tents be closer together? Gallowgate looked at the boy and shook his head. It seemed he meant it to be a friendly smile, but it was without warmth, and Mungo thought he saw a flash of menace cross his thin lips. Perhaps, like Hamish, he didn't like for his authority to be questioned. Nah, better to be far from the fire, Gallowgate said. He went back to pulling the guy line tight. He strummed it to check its tension. Don't you want to see the stars? So there's a really fantastic element of menace running through this book. And one of the interesting things about it in terms of camping is that they're hideously unprepared for proper camping. They've gone to stay by a lochside near to Glasgow, where it's always going to be cold in the middle of the night. And they've only got a very flimsy tent, probably as flimsy as this one. They don't have any mats to sleep on or any air beds or anything like that. And so eventually the only way to stay warm is to huddle up together. And that's possibly not the best idea. But I will leave you to read that book, which is by no means a child-friendly, positive camping kind of book, but it is a really brilliant, fantastic novel full of remarkable truths about what it would have been like to grow up in the 1980s gay, and it's also very beautiful and utterly gripping and at times deeply shocking, but definitely one to read possibly in a tent on a dark night, though I think you might have very bad dreams if you did. So I would probably read it actually not while camping. I think that, I would say, is probably a book not to read while you're camping unless you are very strong of heart. Other books that come up when talking about camping is Lord of the Flies by William Golding, which isn't really a camping novel, let's face it, but it is about being forced to camp on an island when their aeroplane crashes. And for anyone that hasn't read that yet, absolutely brilliant, completely compelling, and quite a tragic book in many ways, and one that has been much imitated in the years since it was written. And one of my favourite imitations actually is by Libby Bray, and it's called Beauty Queens, and it's all about lots of women who are beauty pageant queens who all get stuck on an island in very much the same way as Lord of the Flies. Their plane crashes and they have to work out how they're going to survive, when up to now their main priority has actually been how to keep their long nails looking beautiful, how to coiffure their eyelashes, and they haven't had to worry even slightly about survival. And that's actually a very funny parody. So, books to read while camping. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the best books to read while camping. I must say, I am completely compelled to mention the good old Moomin Trolls. Comet in Moomin Land would be a brilliant book to read while you're camping. The Moomins do very much make me think of camping because they essentially live outside most of the time, although they do have their wonderful Moomin home, but they spend a lot of time going out camping in the woods. And Comet in Moomin Land is a really great one if you've never read any of the Moomin books, because it's all about the Moomin family waiting for a comet to arrive and fearing what will happen when the comet comes crashing down on them. So in many ways it's a book about worrying and a book about how to cope with fear and fearing imminent destruction. It does have beautiful illustrations that I'm showing you, but being a Moomin book, it does have a positive outcome, and I won't give away the story, but it's all very much based in the woodland, which is not always a happy woodland. Sometimes it's quite sinister, and the characters within the book are absolutely brilliant, and it's definitely a great one to read by a campfire, maybe to read aloud with a friend. Another brilliant one book to read while camping would be Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell, which is another survival book all about a girl who survives after being abandoned on an island by her family. She's called Karana, and she has to live, I think, for 17 years all on her own. So this is a book in the same sort of lines as Hatchet by Gary Paulson, and also My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George. Another really beautiful and brilliant book, and a great one to read for any age, but it is actually a children's book. So books, other books to read while camping. Short stories, I would say, are fantastic to read while camping because you can read them aloud by the campfire. And you're mentioning The Hobbit. I have to say that is a fantastic book to read while camping. And I even remember reading it while I was camping back in the day. I think when I was about 11, um, our dad started reading it to us, and then I carried on afterwards. That is a perfect, absolutely perfect epitome of a camping book. Um, so I do often think that the good old classic tales are the best for reading while camping, but short stories of any era are also great. But I think it's very tempting to read classic stories and maybe children's books. And probably the absolute ultimate camping book, I would say, that is a brilliant one to read is Oversea Under Stone, which is actually, so I'm getting a bit uncomfortable in this strange camping position. The Dark is Rising collection, which is an absolutely amazing, fantastic series of books, all of which take place in Cornwall. They are about children, for children. It's somewhat a little bit in the vein of the Narnia books, which would also be brilliant camping books, let's face it, to read. But the Dark is Rising trilogy are a really fantastic selection of books to read while camping because they're full of adventures. They very much take place outside. They're all about surviving against the elements, and they're really gripping. And there's also ghosts, Arthurian legends, and it's all set in Cornwall, which is where I tend to go camping. So I very much associate those books with being in Cornwall. But I'd love to know if you have any other favourites. Do send me comments, send me questions, send me an email. Let me know what are your favourite camping books. And thanks so much for joining me this evening. It's been lovely having you here in my tent, which definitely is going to need some repairs before we take it out for the summer. But I'm very excited about reading some brilliant books in my tent very soon, and maybe I'll just keep it up for the next few weeks and make it into my reading chamber. My tent is a great place to be for reading. You can even put it up inside your house and read in your tent because it cuts you off from the rest of the world in a rather brilliant way. So thanks so much for coming this evening, and see you in a week's time. Do tell me if you have any topic requests as well. Thanks for joining me, and see you soon. Good night.